Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to Syriana Analysis. I'm your host, Kevork Almassian. Thank you very much for tuning in to today's special stream and conversation with our dear friend William. His name has been popping up a lot recently in the live chat, and people were asking, you continue promoting his book. His book is always in the description below, by the way, for you to purchase, but you're not inviting him. And here is he. Now we're going to make a geopolitical roundtable about the whereabouts of the region after October 7. We will start with the event itself, the attack that happened from Gaza against the kibbutzes and the military posts of the Israeli occupation forces, and the events unfolded afterwards. And we will try to make sense of these events and try to come up with some answers. Some of them probably would be controversial for some people, others would be probably acceptable. But we on this channel, we are going to discuss all sorts of theories and arguments and speculations as well, because we believe in an open conversation. William, thank you so much, my friend, for coming to the show again.
Hey, thanks, Kevork. It's good to talk to you again.
It's a pleasure to have you. I think you were ahead of me. This was a few months ago, last time we met, and we were discussing about the attack on October 7 itself. I think this picture is a little bit clearer at the current moment, especially with few confessions, one of which is from General Qaani of Iran, saying that Iran had no clue about the attack itself. Now, why we are focusing on October 7? Because the events unfolded afterwards has led into severe consequences and an outcome which I believe is historical and catastrophic for the people of the region. I'm not blaming the Palestinians. I'm not blaming any particular group. I'm saying the events unfolded after October 7. If we want to go a little bit into the event itself, the attack happened on October 7. You watched it on TV or on your social media. Did you on the first day tell yourself that this can't be a surprise attack, or you were also caught into the hype of the press like myself, which I thought this would be 100% surprise attack? And if it wasn't a surprise attack, what evidence do we have, or what factors do we have in files do we have in our hands that could indicate that this was not surprise attack for Israel, but they were anticipating it and they let it happen?
Yeah, so I think like most people, when the images first came out, there's all this like even, body camera footage from the Hamas fighters, and then all the footage and the propaganda that Israel was putting out. The first impression was, okay, it was a surprise attack by Hamas, and Hamas killed, maybe 1,200 Israelis. When you first start looking at things, that's the impression you get. But then, shortly after 7th of October, I came back here to Beirut. And for the next 3 months, in addition to doing my regular work for the Cradle, that's all I did for the next 3 months was study October 7th. And all of the coverage for the Cradle about the 7th of October, I wrote. And so I did a ton of work exposing the Hannibal Directive and how many people that the Israelis had killed. And I wrote like an 80-page article about that for the Libertarian Institute. It's called What Really Happened on 7th of October. Unfortunately, there's many other articles with that exact title. It was a terrible choice, but if anyone wants to read it, you could Google the Libertarian Institute and What Really Happened on 7th of October. But the more I studied it, of course, the first thing you discover is that, hey, Hamas killed some people, but most of these Israelis that were killed that day, they were killed by incendiary fire from Apache helicopters and from drones that were dispatched to, per the Hannibal Directive, to kill not only Hamas fighters, but also any Israelis that they took captive or hostage. And so all of like the buildings and the homes that were destroyed in Kibbutz Be'eri, for example, those were, if you just look at the footage from the air, these homes were destroyed, and they were destroyed. Yep. The roofs were caved in and they're totally burned and destroyed. This is not from Hamas Kalashnikovs or RPGs. This was from helicopter and drone fire. Anyways, now it's not controversial that the Hannibal Directive was invoked. Everyone knows that. Again, the helicopters were opening fire on vehicles of Hamas fighters as they were taking captives towards the border. So they would, hit a car with a missile or with this incendiary machine gun fire from the helicopters and burn alive anyone that was in the car, whether it was Israeli hostages or Hamas fighters. And the same thing at the Nova Festival. Most of the people there were burned alive, from this helicopter fire. So that's the first level that the thing you realize when you start studying it closely is like, okay, the first impression I got that Hamas committed atrocities like you can't believe, rapes and all these things, okay, that's nonsense. Really, the Israelis killed most people. But then the second level is the more you study it, and then secondly, over the course of the last 2 years, there's been more and more evidence that has come out, which indicates that, yeah, the Israelis definitely knew that the attack was going to happen, that they let it happen because they needed a Pearl Harbor type or 9/11 type style attack against them so that they could then launch this war to remake the Middle East, and the consequences of which we've seen, which are, again, obviously Gaza being flattened and destroyed, and then also Hezbollah being severely weakened, and then Syria falling, and then also, preparations for a broader war against Iran. So if you want, I can talk about the specifics of the evidence of why, Israel must have known that Hamas was going to attack. But anyways, that was kind of the evolution of my thinking about it.
I would like to know a little bit specifics about the prior knowledge of Israel. Was it that they had people in Gaza? Because Hamas would, of course, is infiltrated just like Hezbollah, just like Iran. If Iran is not immune for infiltration, for sure that Hamas was infiltrated. I was watching a video. I will show you this video of a former Mossad officer who basically talks about like this ceasefire agreement that we have now in the Gaza Strip is just an ink and paper, because we could send people to Gaza, or we have people in Gaza to fire rockets on us. Those are our people. And we would say the offensive will continue. We're just waiting for the hostages to return. I will show you this video because it tells a lot about the mentality of the people in Mossad and how would they think about such an event.
Finish the job?
We will never finish the job because we always have new enemies.
Why didn't we take Khomeini out?
I tell you what, because he is not just a regular leader, he's a religious leader, and it's different.
You start a religious war?
Okay. And they can replace him. And, sometimes if you think about Tehran, it looks like we suddenly stop and we made this ceasefire. But come on, let me compare it to Lebanon.
Okay.
Because it was exactly when we entered to Lebanon, to the south of Lebanon, and we destroy so many buildings with missiles and the Dahya and everything. And suddenly we got a ceasefire. There is no agreement. We just have a ceasefire. I remember they spoke about 2 months and then they extended in 1 month. And now we are acting almost every day in Syria, in Lebanon.
Post-Iran attack, we're certainly living in a safer world today.
Of course. And I hope that we will have another attack. We'll attack them and they will attack us. Let me tell you something about Gaza.
Yeah.
That at the end of the day, after we bring all the hostages, we will have agreement. But there is something that's stronger than this agreement. When Gaza will forever pay for this terror attack.
What do you see as the future for Gaza?
No future.
Parking lot? A dumping ground?
For what a creative idea.
I do.
Okay, we have agreement. Suddenly they send some missiles. Our people send missiles from inside. And then we said, oh, there is a missile from Gaza. So now we can answer them.
So you think that's also something that's possible?
Everything is possible. We are going to erase Gaza. We have to take the people there and send them to Libya.
So this shows also the mentality of a Mossad operative, basically a former Mossad operative, telling our people could fire missiles from Gaza on Israel. If they're saying this publicly, This is why I want to go a little bit into more particular or more specifics. To which theory do you lean more, that this was planned by Sinwar himself and Israel was watching it, then let it happen, or they had bad apples inside Hamas who participated, let's say, in the planning process for such an attack?
On that might be a coin flip. Like, I don't have any evidence that there are people in Hamas that were deliberately agents. There was some speculation of that. I remember there was a Palestinian journalist here in Beirut that I met shortly after 7th of October. He was more of a Fatah supporter. His family had been members of Fatah for generations. And his theory at that time was that Sinwar was probably an Israeli agent. I mean, he was in an Israeli prison for I forget how many years after Gilad Shalit was kidnapped, maybe 10 or 15 years. He spoke Hebrew perfectly. He was released in the Gilad Shalit deal. And so this particular Palestinian journalist speculated that, Sinwar was probably an agent.
He spent 22 years in prison.
22 years. So it's kind of like Abdullah Öcalan, the PKK leader. He's been in a Turkish prison for 20 years. Like, are you really not turned and working for them at that point? So I don't know if that's true. I kind of lean away from that, but that's something that definitely some, people speculate about. But what I can say for sure is that, when that number one, Israelis wanted to attack Gaza and start a big war, especially the religious fanatics like Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir and the right-wing settlers. They wanted to trigger like this apocalyptic end of days Gog and Magog style war to destroy Gaza. And the settlers like Orit Stroke, who is a minister, she made comments a few months before 7th of October saying, look, we need to retake Gaza and rebuild Jewish settlements there, and it's going to be a bloody war to do that, and there will be many casualties, but we still need to do it. She said that about 6 months before the 7th of October, when some legislation was passed to reverse some bans on settlements in the West Bank, settlement building in the West Bank and in Gaza that were passed in 2005 after Ariel Sharon ordered the disengagement. So there's already this political movement within the settler community before 7th of October saying, hey, we want to go back to Gaza. We want to send all of the people in Gaza to Egypt or Libya or some other place. The Israelis were trying to do that way back in, they were asking Hosni Mubarak, back before he was toppled, whether he'd be willing to accept all of the Gazans into the Sinai. So anyways, the settlers were wanting a big war, despite that it would be bloody and they would suffer a lot of losses, because they had this idea that, hey, Gaza is part of God, the land of Israel that God gave us, and we need to take it back. So right there you have the motive for the Israelis to do a false flag to start a war. And the thing that's really important to remember is that the Israelis, Israel is basically, a parasite state. Israel is a parasite on the United States of America, or the U.S. government. So they can't fight a war or do anything without sucking resources or depending on resources, money, weapons, and so forth from the United States. And we saw that with Biden. How many things did Joe Biden have to do to keep the weapons flowing to Israel so they could destroy Gaza? Israel cannot do anything without that support from the United States. So to get that support from the United States and ensure that they can keep those weapons flowing, they always have to fight wars that appear defensive.
Mm-hmm.
They can't just say, hey, we're going to go invade Gaza, kick all these people out and do what we want, because then Congress and people in the U.S. would say, hey, we're not going to send weapons. They wouldn't have the justification for it. So the Israelis always need to fight that way. And in fact, I'll try not to go into too much detail, but there were similar things that happened in 1973, where Golda Meir knew that the Egyptians were about to attack. In fact, there's some evidence that they coordinated that whole thing with Anwar Sadat. But Golda Meir stated that she let the Egyptians attack and kill about 1,000 Israeli soldiers before she mobilized the Israeli army, because she said specifically, I need to be able to go to the Americans and say, hey, give me these weapons because we just got attacked. She said if we had been mobilizing our forces before the Egyptians attacked us, then it would have looked like we went on the offensive, and Kissinger and the U.S. administration at the time wouldn't have given them the weapons that they needed. So there was a similar thing too in 1978. The Israelis wanted to invade Lebanon. And there was a Palestinian militant, a woman named Fedayeen, named Dalil Maghrabi, if you remember her. And she and some other PLO operatives, they got on a boat from a refugee camp in Lebanon. I think it was from Sur or Tyre, landed on the beach near Haifa, and they hijacked a bus, like a school bus, and there were a bunch of like women and children on the bus, and they were going to drive the bus towards Tel Aviv and do an attack. So what happened? The Yamam special forces ended up stopping the bus, and they got into a gun battle. And then what did the Israelis do?
They bombed the bus.
An Apache helicopter came and bombed the bus and killed like 40, 50 Israeli kids. So that was actually the first use of the Hannibal Directive. It goes all the way back to 1978. Most people think the first instance was like in the 2008-2009 Gaza war. It goes all the way back to 1978. And guess what they did 4 days later? They invaded Lebanon.
Yes,
they already had mobilized their troops and they were ready for an invasion, but they were waiting for the pretext to do the invasion. So they had to wait for the Dalal Maghrabi to do this attack. And in Ronan Bergman's book about the history of the Mossad, he talks about how Israeli intelligence knew that Dalal Maghrabi was going to do the attack. So again, you just see this happens over and over. So sorry for getting sidetracked, but so now if you move towards the situation in Gaza, there's an article in Ynet, or Yediot Ahronot, the major Israeli newspaper, from 2018. Well, let me back up. When Hamas did the attack on 7th of October, everyone said, oh my gosh, it was a surprise. And who could have imagined that they would have just like broken through the fence and used these like helicopter things and drones to do an attack, like a surprise attack like this. And they said it was an intelligence failure, and all the articles in the New York Times, all these things, they're saying it was a failure of imagination. The Israelis just couldn't imagine, all their intelligence, all their surveillance, they just couldn't imagine that Hamas would do an attack like this. And they just took us by surprise. And all the pro-resistance people, including myself, we were like, this is awesome. Look, Hamas, like, you know, they had this great success. They took the Israelis by surprise. But guess what? In 2018, there's an article published in Ynet where Israeli generals say they're doing drills and preparation for Hamas to do a ground attack in which they carry out a mass kidnapping, and in which they use drones. And they said they were doing drills and exercises to prepare for exactly that scenario that we then saw in 2025, 7 years later, that all the commentators said, oh, who could ever imagine that? You know? And it's a lot like 9/11, you know, George Bush said the same thing. Oh, who could have thought like that Al-Qaeda would have this idea to like fly planes into the World Trade Center? Well, guess what? The main counterterror guy, Richard Clark, he was issuing like intelligence reports like in the months before 9/11 saying, hey, you know, guess what? We have indications Al-Qaeda might be flying planes into the World Trade Center.
Yeah.
And those reports got to Bush, you know, he read them. And then after 9/11, he's like, oh, who could have imagined, you know? So Hamas carries out the exact same attack that the Israeli military had been deliberately planning for years, and were aware that that type of an attack would take place for years, and then they say it's a surprise. So then in addition to that, there's all these reports that Israeli intelligence had the plan for the Hamas attack as early as 2022. They called it Jericho Wall, if I remember right.
Yes.
And so they had that. And then Hamas didn't even like hide the preparations. They built like model settlements even near the Gaza border, even near the Gaza border fence. They built these like model Israeli settlements where they were like doing like training exercises in like the year before October 7th. Hamas even made a television show. They have their own television channel. They even made a dramatic television program in which they depict exactly what happened on 7th of October, where Hamas carries out this attack and does mass kidnappings. It was on their own TV channel. And then Yahya Sinwar, he gave like a speech at one point where he referenced the television show. He said, "This is what we're going to do to Israel." And then in the months ahead of 7th of October, there are all the female spotters that are on the border. And they were constantly sending reports up to their superiors saying, "Hey, like there's these weird training exercises Hamas is doing. It seems like they're going to like do an attack and they're going to invade." And then their superiors just blew off the reports, and the women complained later that, "Oh, well, they ignored the reports because they're sexist and we're women, so they didn't take us seriously." You know, they were reporting exactly what was going to happen. And then when you get to like the night of 7th of October, there's way more. Well, there's even more sketchy stuff with like the Nova rave, where they allow a rave to be planned right on the border. And then it had to get all these like approvals. At first, it didn't get approved. The army was like, "No, we're not going to let them do a concert like that." And then all of a sudden, at the last minute, they're like, "Oh, okay, never mind. Like, it's fine. You can do the concert." And then on the night of 7th or 6th of October, the night before, Hamas, the Nukhba Brigade, they're like special forces that did the initial attack. They activated all these SIM cards, Israeli SIM cards, so they could coordinate during the attack. And the Israeli intelligence picked that up. And then in the morning of 7th of October at 3 a.m., there were all these orders sent to the Gaza division that was like guarding, the border, telling them to withdraw their forces at 3 a.m. in the morning on 7th of October. And there was one kibbutz actually right near the border where the message for the Israeli army to withdraw their forces, it didn't reach the kibbutz.
Yeah.
So the army stayed there. And that's one of the few places where there was basically no casualties because the army was there. And so when Hamas guys came, they just fled. In addition to that, for example, the chief of staff, Herzl Halevi, his wife came out and said that Herzl Halevi left the house well before 7 a.m. on 7th of October. And when he got out of bed, he got ready to go, and he kissed her and said goodbye. And as he was saying goodbye, he told her, "Gaza will be destroyed." And I just found a report where it turns out he left way before 7 a.m. The Hamas attack started at 6:30, but Herzl Halevi, the chief of staff, he was at this emergency meeting at 4 a.m. So he must have left his house at like 3:30, something like that, telling his wife Gaza will be destroyed. And yet the Hamas attack didn't take place for like a couple more hours. And there was a high-ranking military official that went to the location of the Nova Festival about an hour before the Hamas attack. They had all these indications that Hamas was mobilizing, and no one told the organizers of the concert. And in addition to that, at the Nova Festival itself, there's indications that some of the massacres were staged. There's one famous video where this supposed guy who wasn't even like an active member of the military, but he like lived in northern Israel but wanted to like go and like help out on his own. So he just drove by himself all the way from the north of Israel down to the Nova Festival. And he somehow showed up at the festival, and there's this tent where there was like all these coolers near like the main stage where people would buy drinks, and there's all these bodies. There's like 14 or 15 bodies all like underneath this tent near all these coolers, like Coca-Cola coolers and stuff like that. And you can tell that the video is totally staged.
And
I
he
wrote about
arrived
that.
faster, and he arrived faster than an Israeli helicopter. Basically, he came all the way from northern Israel to the Nova Festival, and yet the Israeli army was still on a standoff. Like they didn't shoot yet here.
Yeah, and he claims that like he just convinced the soldiers that were there that he was like one of their commanders, and so they let him in. Anyway, I detail about how I think, or why I know it was staged in the article, what really happened on the 7th of October. There's also this guy, user on Twitter, Boltzmann Booty, if people know him, he's documented a lot of the stuff about, why it's clear that the Israeli army knew. But he found some articles in Israeli media talking about how there's an Israeli military official who said that a bunch of extra bodies were dumped at the Nova Festival.
Wow. By the way, there is also this report which popped up on the 9th of October. Egypt intelligence official says Israel ignored repeated warnings of something big. An Egyptian intelligence official said that Jerusalem had ignored repeated warnings that the Gaza-based terror group, Hamas, was planning something big, which included an apparent direct notice from Cairo's intelligence minister to the prime minister. The Egyptian official said, which often serves as a mediator between Israel and Hamas, had spoken repeatedly with the Israelis about something big without elaborating, but his warnings have been again ignored. I think we could add to the list of the indications. And since you mentioned also 9/11 briefly, I also want to show the people this very short video of Netanyahu predicting 9/11 basically 6 years earlier in 1995.
Getting this question in the 1990s, and I said that the West really doesn't understand militant Islam. So I wrote a book in 1995, and I said that if the West doesn't wake up to the suicidal nature of militant Islam, the next thing you'll see is the militant Islam is bringing down the World Trade Center.
Take it as you wish.
And the reality is, immediately after 9/11, we know that the Jewish neocons in the Bush administration wanted to take out 7 countries in 5 years.
Yeah.
And we know that's what eventually led to the so-called Syrian revolution, which my book is about, and which obviously you're an expert on. And, without 9/11, the Israelis couldn't, take out all these countries that they wanted to take out. Like, again, they're a parasite. They rely on the United States to get on board with their agenda to do these things that they want to do, because they rely on the US for money and for weapons. And so they have to do things to convince the Americans or the American public that Israel's enemies are America's enemies. You know what I mean?
And they're fighting as a fortress of democracy in the region, and the security of Israel is intertwined with the security of the United States. And now Netanyahu is talking about alleged Iranian ICBMs reaching between 8,000 to 11,000 kilometers without a shred of evidence. It is an 8,000 kilometer of bullshit. Sorry. I have deconstructed completely that lie in an article. It's so hilarious that he's selling it to complete dumb people, people who never understood how missiles are made and how you can even detect when a country is developing such a weapon. William, the October 7 happened. Regardless if it was let it happen or it was surprise attack, we let the people make up their mind. There are so many other people who can say that it was a surprise attack and we're bringing a different point of view. But after the October 7, let's focus specifically on the axis of resistance. So we're talking about the major player Iran, Syria, Hezbollah, Hamas, Ansarullah. How do you evaluate the outcome of this conflict now that we have a ceasefire agreement in Gaza and we have a peace deal in Gaza? How do we evaluate the pros and cons or ups and downs? What the axis of resistance gained from this and what they have lost?
Well, unfortunately, it's a pretty negative picture, because I remember, again, I was in Beirut just after the 7th of October. we thought that the war was going to be, or I thought that war was going to come to Lebanon about that time, and it took really almost a year for it really to come to Lebanon. But the idea at the time here was, look, there's something called the unity of the fronts. Again, you've got the axis of resistance. If Iran and Hezbollah and Hamas and Ansar Allah in Yemen are all coordinated and working together, and even the Palestinian resistance groups in the West Bank, like in Jenin and Nablus, they allegedly were getting Iranian weapons before the 7th of October. There's the idea that, look, if the axis of resistance, I guess the Iraqis too, the Muqawama in Iraq, if they're all attacking Israel at the same time, Israel can't fight on all these fronts and repel attacks from Lebanon, from Iran, from Gaza, etc. And so this, in addition to all of the missiles that Iran was developing, like before 7th of October, there was constantly news stories, the Iranians talking about the new ballistic missiles they were developing. Everyone here in Lebanon was very confident about the missiles that Hezbollah had, that they could, if Israel tried to destroy Beirut, then Hezbollah could destroy Tel Aviv. But the problem is from the very beginning, and you mentioned this earlier, where the Iranian general Pani, he said that, look, Hamas didn't tell us about 7th of October. That doesn't make sense. If there's this unity of fronts and an axis of resistance, why would Hamas do such a game-changing move without letting any of their alleged close allies know? And maybe they just thought, hey, we're going to do it, and if these guys help us, they'll help us. If they don't, they don't. But the problem, again, for me is when I look back on it, it's like, well, how strong could an axis of resistance be if Qatar, or if it involves Hamas, and Qatar is Hamas's main backer?
Mm-hmm.
Like, that doesn't make sense. There's a huge U.S. military base in Qatar. We know it's basically a colony of the U.S. and of Israel. And
Simple
we know
questions, logical questions, and still these questions are missing.
Yeah, and you and I know, again, the reason maybe you and I think about this more than maybe other people do is because we know the history in Syria very well, which was that in Yarmouk camp in the suburbs of Damascus, when the Israeli-sponsored Free Syrian Army and Jabhat al-Nusra invaded Yarmouk in December of 2012 against the wishes of the Palestinians, who wanted to just remain neutral. But when those groups invaded, Hamas in the camp, they formed a special militia, Aknaf Beit al-Maqdis, and they, getting a lot of money and funding from Qatar, they fought side by side with the pro-Israeli Jabhat al-Nusra and Free Syrian Army against Syria, which had been providing them a refuge for all these decades. And so that right there, if you're like, how is Hamas basically fighting on the side of Israel in Yarmouk for several years in Syria? And then suddenly, and again, Qatar is their main backer. How can we imagine that there's really this axis of resistance that's going to cooperate and work together, and that it involves like Qatari-based Hamas in addition to Iranian-supported Hezbollah and Iran, and like there's just problems in the logic,
I think the problem in the logic is very clear. Like, you can see how Qatar played the biggest psyop role in the region in the past 2-3 decades, whether through Al Jazeera, and how they have been allowed to play the role of bringing Hamas on the side of Qatar by allowing Qatar to fund Hamas inside Gaza and outside Gaza and hosting them on its soil. And the moment Hamas turned its back on Syria and Iran, basically, and Hezbollah in Syria, this should have been a big warning. And that's why I've been very cautious of Hamas. And people come and tell me, yeah, this was the political wing and that was the military wing and all this stuff. But at no point, even the military wing, or Kataib Qassam, denounced and criticized what Khalid Mish'al and Ismail Haniyeh have done in Syria by propping up a new militia in the Yarmouk camp to fight against their basically should be the allies in the axis of resistance, right? And once the October 7 happened, I think that the perception is that everybody knew inside Hamas, those who planned it, that Hezbollah, at least Hezbollah will intervene in support of Hamas if the war becomes a large conflict, or a large conflict is erupted with Israel. Because Hezbollah, if Hezbollah intervened in Syria on the merit that we are in Syria to protect Syria so that we can protect Palestine, then if a major genocidal war is erupted against the Palestinians and Hezbollah doesn't intervene, then how would Hezbollah appear in front of the general public in the Arab world, right? They would be hypocrites. So Hezbollah withdrew many of its forces from Syria and sent them to southern Lebanon in order to support the Palestinians. And once they did that, this was a window of opportunity for Erdogan and Netanyahu to coordinate and knock out Assad. Now that Assad is gone, I think the chain is broken between Iran and the other players in what used to be called the axis of resistance, right? And why I say it used to be called, or even I would call it so-called axis of resistance, because there was no axis. And Hamas, in this case, this attack, in my opinion, has led into the complete annihilation of Syria. Syria doesn't exist on the map any longer as a nation state, as a sovereign state. And nobody can convince me that Hezbollah has not received the blow. The decapitation of the leadership of Hezbollah is irreplaceable from at least in the short run. And you see the successors of Nasrallah are not in the same, they cannot fill his shoes, basically. Nasrallah was more a regional actor rather than just a local actor, and now Hezbollah has become a local actor. So if you want to evaluate the outcome of October 7 and the events unfolded, I see that this is probably worse than the Six-Day War in 1967. Because now Syria doesn't even have a national army any longer. It's completely there is a huge vacuum in the country, security vacuum, that nobody can replace it. So Israel now is a dominant power in the region. The US is also dominant power in the region, and I don't agree with the analysis and the assessments of many people in the axis of resistance who say this is a victory. Look how many hostages the Palestinians have released. Excuse me, over 80,000 civilians have been killed in Gaza. That can we count that? Syria is gone. Hezbollah has been localized. Can we count these things, or it is only about a few hostages in the Israeli prison? I think, strategically speaking, it's quite obvious that the axis of resistance has received a major blow in this case, and they could probably not recover in the next few decades. They will need more than that.
Well, again, unfortunately, I agree with you. And, again, I remember when, like, the death toll of Palestinians hit 10,000. And now, if I remember, it's probably just about a month in. Maybe like November 2023. I couldn't believe it. I was just like in shock. I'm like, I can't believe there's 10,000 Palestinians dead. I couldn't believe it. But at the time, the Iranian foreign minister, Amir Abdullahian, he was saying, look, at that point, the Israelis were just bombing Gaza from the air, and they hadn't done the ground invasion yet. And that was a big question. Are they going to do a ground invasion? And the Iranians were saying, that's a red line. If the Israelis do a ground invasion, like, that's it. We're going to step in. And they didn't, and maybe they have good reasons to. I'm not saying, they had to or they should have, but they didn't. And Israel just had a free hand to do what they needed to do in Gaza. When they were largely done with that, after about a year, they turned their attention to Lebanon. They did the pager attack. And pardon the French, but they just bombed the shit out of Lebanon. And I was here in Beirut when they were bombing. I'd watch at night on Twitter where the Israeli Army spokesman Avichai Adrae would like announce on Twitter where they were going to bomb. And if it was nearby here in Beirut or Saida, I would get up in the morning and I would go to the place and see where the bombings were. And they bombed and killed a lot of people here. And, and then there was a ceasefire once they were done with Hezbollah, again, killing like all of their important leadership. And once they were basically done and there was a ceasefire, they immediately turned their attention to Syria. And as you predicted, that Jolani and the guys from Idlib were going to attack like about a month before it happened, And sure enough, it did. Like you said, Hezbollah had to remove their fighters and stuff from Syria and bring him here. But once they were defeated, that opened the door for Jolani to take Damascus, again, through a little bit of fighting, but mostly through a deal between Israel, the US, Turkey, and Russia. Well, they just let Jolani basically walk into Damascus. And now that puts Hezbollah in a very difficult position. I mean, most of their missiles were created like in Misyaf in Syria, and then transported from Syria across the border to the Bekaa Valley. And now Syria is gone. Iran can't airlift weapons and things over Syrian airspace or move them by land. And the United States is very powerful here in Lebanon, and they kind of control the army here. So Hezbollah, even to get weapons by the sea, is like very difficult. So I just think it's really hard to imagine that the axis, to whatever extent you think it existed, that it's somehow in a better position. So again, Israel, instead of there being a unity of fronts where all these groups could attack Israel at once on these different fronts, and by cooperating, they would have the advantage over Israel. Instead, Israel had the chance to just take out one enemy after another. First Gaza. And you can say, well, they haven't defeated Hamas, but is that really their objective? More their objective was to just level the place. They spent more time in the last year just demolishing buildings than they have fighting Hamas, because that's really their objective, is to make the place unlivable, force Palestinians, to basically not be able to live here and have no choice but to leave. And then they went to Hezbollah, then they went to Syria, and then of course they did the 12-day war against Iran. And I think a lot of people imagine or think that the Israelis aren't done in Iran yet. So it's very much like, again, after 9/11, once they got 9/11, then they just went to Afghanistan, and they went to Iraq, and then, just on and on down the line. So they did the same thing after the 7th of October. That gave them the pretext and the supply of weapons from the U.S. that they needed. Anytime they said, we want some more weapons, all they had to say was 7th of October, beheaded babies, rapes, and then they could get all the weapons that they needed from the U.S. So 7th of October, it was just this, that was like the necessary prelude to all of the successes that Israel has had since that time.
I will go one step further and a little bit raise a very controversial and provocative idea or a statement. When Syria regime change happened in Syria, Khalid Mish'al said the liberation of Syria from the Assad regime or the Assad tyranny is a pre-phase for the liberation of Palestine. This is Khalid Mish'al, based in Qatar, from the political bureau of Hamas. When the ceasefire agreement has been reached now in Gaza, we had also similar, or not similar, but also ceasefire agreement in Lebanon. The brokers were the same. Americans brokered this ceasefire agreement in Lebanon and in Gaza, right? But in Lebanon, when the ceasefire agreement was reached, I didn't see a statement of Hezbollah thanking Donald Trump for the ceasefire agreement, unlike in Gaza. Hamas thanking Donald Trump. Are you kidding me? Sorry, this is a little bit even too much to process. It is American weapons which killed the Palestinians. The vast majority of these weapons came under Biden and Donald Trump. All the Palestinians were killed because of the U.S. weapons which were delivered to Israel. I mean, were it not for the air bridge and the supplies of the American officials to Israel, you mentioned Israel cannot continue fighting on its own, right, in the region. They don't have the military capacity, the production, even the air defenses were supplied by the US. Even the US Army was operating some of these air defenses. But thank you, Trump. I don't know what to say about this.
Well, if you want to be, if you want to be a bit more cynical too, going back to the 7th of October, like it became clear to like a lot of people in the independent media, like I said, myself and here at the Cradle, also, the good folks at the Electronic Intifada and the Gray Zone, they were pointing out the Hannibal Directive killed,
Yes.
most of the Israelis that day. Al Jazeera barely talked about it. And they would have been the ones, I'm just here sitting in my shitty apartment in Beirut, trying to figure all this out and write about it for my $1,000 a month salary or whatever. And Al Jazeera, who has all the resources in the world and all the access, they could have just interviewed a bunch of Hamas fighters, like, hey, what happened when you did the attack? Like, what happened when you were in the kibbutz? Like, did a bunch of Israeli helicopters come and burn everyone alive? They could have just, they could have easily, they were the ones that were really in the place to expose all that, and they didn't. They kept pushing this line like, oh, Hamas did this amazing attack and they killed it reinforced like the Israeli propaganda. So again, you and I, from the history of the Syria war, we know how Al Jazeera just lies nonstop, and we saw that with the recent massacres in Sweden of the Druze. We saw that with the recent massacres of the Alawites in the coast in March. Al Jazeera just lies. And of course, they did that throughout the entire Syria war since 2011. So you have to wonder about Al Jazeera. I mean, again, if you go back to like how Al Jazeera was created, like all of their journalists, I mean, they're obviously Qatari funded, but all of their journalists, where did they come from?
BBC.
Came from the BBC. And if the journalists all work for the BBC, that means they work for British intelligence. So Al Jazeera is totally compromised, and even Hamas. I mean, they just barely even talked about the Hannibal Directive, even though it would have been to their advantage to do it. To say, look, we're not the bad guys here. The Israelis burned all their own civilians alive from their own helicopters, but Hamas barely even mentioned it. So then also the thing is, from the very, very beginning of the war, Benjamin Netanyahu and Bezalel Smotrich, literally they had like a cabinet meeting on the evening of 7th of October. And Bezalel Smotrich said, we need to prosecute the war and we need to not worry about the Israeli hostages. We shouldn't worry about the hostages. We need to defeat Hamas. Because again, for Smotrich, he doesn't care about hostages. He just wants to destroy Gaza and ethnically cleanse it. So it became clear, like really early on, again, the Israelis killed most of the hostages, all the hostages who died in Gaza, they were killed by Israeli airstrikes, right? Hamas was trying to protect these guys. They were the hostages, but the Israelis were killing them.
Yeah.
So anyways, anyone in Hamas should have realized early on, wow, all the leverage that we might have thought that we had, going back to the old model of Gilad Shalit, where you can exchange one Israeli soldier for more than 1,000 Palestinians. It became very clear early on that actually the Israelis were happy for all the hostages just to get killed and be dead, and that those hostages actually gave zero leverage. And so there's been this game of these negotiations going on for the past 2 years. And of course, Hamas has accepted many different ceasefires, and then Netanyahu sabotages them each time, in another indication that he doesn't give a shit if these hostages come back. So the Hamas guys, probably in the first month or two, they could have realized, or I realized, that they really had zero leverage. And so, but instead of just, saying, look, these hostages give us zero leverage, all they do is allow Israel to continue bombing us and killing Palestinians and flattening the strip, they just kind of went along with this charade of negotiations for 2 full years. And all they did was give Israel the chance to literally demolish most of Gaza. And now that demolition is mostly complete, and it basically guarantees that Palestinians can never live there long term again, because there will be no reconstruction. Israel will not allow it, and you can't expect Palestinians to live in disease-infested tents for the next 20, 30 years.
So what happens next?
Now that Gaza is destroyed, and it's like going to be extremely difficult for Palestinians to continue living there and not be forced to leave just to survive. Now finally Hamas gives the rest of the hostages up, and they don't even, now they have zero, now even if they thought they had leverage before, now they have zero leverage, and they got no guarantee that Israel is even going to withdraw from the Strip. And all, like the comment of this former Israeli intelligence guy that you played earlier, all Israel has to do is say, oh, well, Hamas didn't return all the bodies of the hostages, or oh, we'll just have our own people in Gaza shoot a few rockets, and then we'll just go in and invade again. Like now there's zero guarantee that Israel will stop killing Palestinians. Just like, again, after the ceasefire here in Lebanon, Hezbollah has no leverage over Israel to stop Israel striking Lebanon. So if you want to be really cynical about it, you could say, look, Hamas was playing along with this game, and all it did was just help Israel's objective of destroying Gaza and preparing for the eventual ethnic cleansing,
Do you think the ethnic cleansing will happen now that they say the ceasefire agreement prevents an ethnic cleansing and that Palestinians will stay in Gaza?
I don't think there will be an ethnic cleansing anytime soon. I think it will be slow, and the Israelis will just kind of slowly strangle Gaza, because again, I've been to a lot of places that have been destroyed. I've been to areas, I've been to Mosul, I've been to Sinjar City, that were both destroyed with U.S. airstrikes. Those places, after 10 years, are barely rebuilt. Most of the Yazidis who were ethnically cleansed from Sinjar, they're still living in tents in the Kurdish region. They haven't been able to return. If you look at large parts of Aleppo, if you look at large parts of Damascus, including Yarmouk, including Al-Hajar al-Aswad, including Jobar, including Harasta, including large parts of Homs, Khalidiyya. I mean, there's tons of neighborhoods in Homs. When these areas get destroyed in a war, it's extremely hard to rebuild them and to bring people back, even under the best of circumstances. It would take 10 years, under the best of circumstances. And there's just no way. The Israelis are determined to make Palestinians leave and ensure they can't stay there. So there's no way that Israel will allow for any legitimate reconstruction. So again, most Palestinians are living in tents, and the conditions are so bad. How can you expect them to live this way for the next 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years? The Israelis can just play the long game and basically ensure Gazans just have no future. And just like, again, that Israeli intelligence guy stated, but they don't have to ethnically cleanse everyone now in one fell swoop. They can just keep strangling Gaza, and it will happen gradually over time.
William, last question about Syria. Syria is now led by Jolani. Jolani is apparently accepted by the US, Turkey, Qatar, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Israel, the US, Russia. Iran is still not on the board, 100%. But when you watch what is going on in Syria geopolitically, do you think that Syria is headed toward normalization of relations with Israel anytime soon? And if that happens, what does it mean for Palestine?
Oh, yeah, it's definitely going to happen. I mean, they're going to join the Abraham Accords. They're going to give up the Golan. That was the reason that Israel and the U.S. were supporting Jolani all the way back in 2011, and in Iraq even before that. I mean, when you saw that interview between David Petraeus and Jolani, I mean, I knew this, you knew this, but Petraeus was basically, you could tell he was basically Jolani's mentor. They knew each other from Iraq, and Petraeus, he sat there like a proud father, whose son had accomplished the mission that he had given him, again, which was to help destroy Iraq and try to partition Iraq, and then to try and destroy and partition Syria. And that's what happened. I mean, in my view, the Israelis drove the massacres in Sweda. They drove the massacres in the coast as well. And the Israelis are pushing to basically, if they don't formally divide the country, it will be so fragmented and decentralized, even if it's officially remains all Syria, Obviously, there'll be the Kurdish area under U.S. and SDF control. There'll be Sweda, which will be under Israeli control. There'll be the coast, which will be under Russian control, which means it's de facto under Israeli control. And then Idlib, Aleppo, Hama, Homs, and Damascus will be under Turkish control as it is currently. I mean, MI6 basically runs everything, or sorry, MIT runs everything. MI6 is there too, but MIT runs basically those parts of Syria. And the country will stay that way, and it will be weak. There won't be an army. There'll just be these takfiris that can be sent, to continue massacring Alawites, and when they feel like it. And again, Syria will just be weak and decentralized, which the Israelis openly say that they're trying to do that. So
very sad to hear that you share my thoughts in this case. But my friends, since I always recommend the book Creative Chaos for William van Wagenen, you can purchase his book in the description below. This is an amazing book for those of you who want to go in depth and understand the root cause of the war in Syria and why they have created the creative chaos inside my country, basically. And some of the also false flag operations in this are all in detail explained for you. Many people ask, Kevork, I'm new to Syria, or I want to go more into details of the Syrian conflict. Well, you have the book. It's there. You can purchase it and read it. I think it will take you 2 weeks to read the book if you really focus on it, and you will understand a lot of context of the Syrian conflict, which is important also to understand what the hell is happening in the region and what happened in Palestine and why Syria was targeted. All these questions are unfortunately not answered well, whether in the mainstream or in the alternative media. They see Syria as if something separate from Palestine, or Lebanon is separate from Syria. No, those files are all interconnected, and you could connect the dots when you read this book and also draw some important conclusions. William, thank you so much, my friend, for again your brilliant insight on this issue. I've been hesitant, let's say, in the past few weeks to mention the issue of the October 7 being Let It Happen event. I know some people would be very emotional. Like, it would be emotional, let's say, for some people to acknowledge that or consider that. Now that there is a ceasefire agreement, I would like to focus even more on this issue, and I think we could bring some value into the literature of this conflict. So thank you so much again for coming.
Yeah. And I guess I'll just say that probably the next book, my plan, I still am going to do it. I'm going to write a book about the Yazidi genocide, because still to this day, people don't realize that, of course, ISIS carried out the Yazidi genocide, but it was really planned by the Kurdish leader Masoud Barzani and the Peshmerga, using ISIS as a proxy or as a tool. And I need to write a book about that. But also, it's becoming clear that, I also need to write a book about 7th of October, because there's all this evidence, and on Twitter you can find it, but it's all in kind of different places, and
yes,
and it's hard to really it's hard to really make sense of it at times, but all the evidence really needs to be collected into one place. And so I probably just need to write a book about it, so that really it's all there, just like all the evidence again in my book about Syria, showing that it wasn't grassroots uprising and protests, that this was a CIA Mossad operation from the beginning. So I guess again, it just seems like maybe that's something I'll need to do. So
yeah. Even if you don't know anything about the root cause of the war in Syria, my friends, you can just now check and watch the outcome of the war with your own objective eyes and draw conclusions. I think that would be also the easiest way to understand why Syria was targeted. But this was all for today, my friends. Thank you very much for tuning in, whether on YouTube, on Rumble, or on Ganji Word, and I will see you tomorrow. Peace be upon you, upon your families. Salam.